The Supreme Court has quietly issued an unexpected order in one of Donald Trump's criminal cases, and the reaction from his legal team has been striking: complete silence. No statements, no emergency filings, and no immediate response from Trump himself. That silence is raising serious questions because this short ruling may have just changed the legal landscape in ways neither side was prepared for. The order, released late yesterday without oral arguments or full briefing, focuses on a narrow procedural issue that Trump's lawyers believed they had already resolved in their favor. Instead, the court's decision did something far more complicated. While it appears limited on the surface, legal analysts say it opens the door to new arguments that could significantly affect not only this case, but Trump's broader legal strategy across multiple prosecutions. The ruling is only 3 pages long and unsigned, yet experts describe it as one of the most consequential Supreme Court actions in Trump-related litigation so far. Not because of what the court clearly stated, but because of what it implicitly allowed. Within hours, prosecutors moved quickly, filing new motions that take advantage of the opening created by the court's language. At the same time, Trump's legal team has gone quiet, suggesting they are still assessing the risks and opportunities created by the order. The decision touches on sensitive issues including presidential immunity, executive privilege, and the limits of prosecuting conduct tied to official actions. The court appears to have given Trump partial relief, while also granting prosecutors new authority that could prove difficult for the defense to contain. What makes this moment especially significant is that it shows the Supreme Court is not acting predictably for either side. The justices are applying legal principles in a way that produces mixed outcomes, helping Trump in some respects while complicating his position in others. So what exactly did the court allow, and how might this reshape the path forward for both prosecutors and the defense, and could this ruling influence how Trump approaches his other cases going forward? Stay with us as we break down what this order really means and why it may be far more important than its length suggests. This Supreme Court order is expected to generate months of additional litigation, as both prosecutors and defense attorneys test the limits of what the court has now authorized. Legal analysts say the long-term impact will depend on how lower courts interpret the ruling and how aggressively each side uses the openings it creates in the next phase of the case. Donald Trump has approached his Supreme Court strategy with the clear assumption that the conservative majority on the court, shaped in part by his own 3 appointments, would ultimately be receptive to arguments limiting criminal exposure for former presidents. That assumption has been based on several factors, including the court's historical concern for executive power, long-standing separation of powers principles, and the judiciary's limited experience with prosecuting former presidents. As a result, Trump's legal team has built much of its defense strategy around getting key questions before the Supreme Court. Across multiple cases, they have focused on raising issues related to presidential immunity, executive privilege, and the scope of criminal liability for actions taken while in office. This approach has involved filing motions designed to preserve appealable issues, slowing trial proceedings, and positioning disputes for Supreme Court review. However, recent rulings suggest the court has been less predictable than Trump's team may have expected. While the justices have ruled in Trump's favor on certain procedural matters, including delays related to immunity appeals and limited privilege claims, they have also rejected some of his broadest legal arguments. Earlier this year, the court's decision on presidential immunity reflected this mixed approach. It recognized immunity for official acts taken while in office, but made clear that former presidents can still face prosecution for unofficial conduct. The court also noted that efforts related to election interference may fall outside the scope of protected presidential duties. In several instances, the court has declined to grant Trump emergency relief, allowing prosecutions to continue despite claims that constitutional rights were being violated. Taken together, these decisions suggest a court that is protective of the presidency as an institution, but not necessarily inclined to shield any individual president from potential accountability. The latest order arises from Trump's federal prosecution related to efforts to overturn the 2020 election and events surrounding January 6. Trump's legal team had asked the Supreme Court to block prosecutors from using certain categories of evidence at trial, arguing that communications between Trump and senior government officials were protected by executive privilege. According to court filings, the defense argued that these communications occurred while Trump was acting in his official capacity as president and involved government decision making. Prosecutors, however, have maintained that privilege does not apply in the way Trump's team claims, particularly when the communications relate to conduct alleged to be unlawful. The Supreme Court's response did not fully accept either side's position. Instead, it issued a narrowly written order that reshapes how these privilege claims may be evaluated going forward, creating new questions that lower courts must now resolve. Legal observers say this ruling underscores an important reality. The Supreme Court is not operating as a predictable backstop for Trump's legal strategy. Its decisions appear guided more by institutional principles than by loyalty to any individual, even a former president who helped shape the court itself. As this case moves back to the lower courts, the focus will now shift to how judges apply the Supreme Court's guidance and whether this order ultimately strengthens or complicates Trump's defense. Trump's legal team argued that executive privilege protects these communications from disclosure even in criminal proceedings. They maintained that allowing prosecutors to introduce this material would weaken future presidents' ability to receive candid advice from senior advisors. However, both the trial court and the appellate court rejected that argument. Those courts concluded that executive privilege does not apply to communications made in furtherance of criminal activity and that the evidence prosecutors sought to introduce fell within the crime fraud exception. Trump then filed an emergency application with the Supreme Court, asking the justices to stay the lower court rulings and to review the scope of executive privilege in this context. Legal observers expected one of two outcomes. Either the court would deny the request and allow the trial to proceed with the evidence, or it would grant the request and temporarily block the evidence while undertaking full review of the privilege questions. What the court did instead surprised both sides. Rather than fully granting or denying Trump's application, the Supreme Court issued a narrowly written, unsigned order that granted partial relief to both parties while creating a new procedural framework that neither side had requested. As is typical for emergency orders, the ruling provided little explanation, leaving significant uncertainty about how it should be applied. The operative language of the order states that the request for a stay is denied as to communications between Trump and senior executive branch officials that relate to the exercise of presidential duties. The application is granted, however, with respect to communications involving advisors acting in a personal or campaign capacity. The court directed the district judge to conduct an in-camera review of disputed materials to determine whether each communication relates to official presidential duties or to personal or campaign matters. Applying the framework established in Trump v. United States, the order explains that communications tied to official duties may not be introduced as direct evidence of criminal conduct but may be considered by the court when evaluating Trump's knowledge and intent. Communications determined to involve personal or campaign activity are not protected by executive privilege and may be introduced without restriction. Legal analysts note that this ruling is significant because it creates distinctions and procedures that did not previously exist. By separating evidence that cannot be used to prove criminal conduct from evidence that may still be considered for intent or awareness, the court has introduced a complex evidentiary structure that trial courts must now implement. The requirement for an in-camera review means the trial judge must privately examine potentially hundreds of communications and make detailed determinations about the capacity in which Trump was acting at the time. These evaluations are expected to be time-consuming and may generate further disputes and appeals. The distinction between evidence admissible to prove criminal conduct and evidence usable only to establish knowledge or intent is also likely to lead to complicated evidentiary rulings and jury instruction challenges at trial. From Trump's perspective, the order provides limited but meaningful protection. The court acknowledged that some communications may be shielded from use as direct evidence, which could narrow the case prosecutors are able to present. At the same time, the ruling allows prosecutors to retain access to a substantial body of material that may still play a role in assessing intent and context. The requirement for an in-camera review means prosecutors cannot simply introduce all disputed communications and argue to the jury that they prove Trump's guilt. By acknowledging that some official presidential communications deserve protection even in criminal cases, the Supreme Court has preserved executive privilege to a limited extent. The review process the court established is also likely to cause additional delays as the trial judge examines the materials privately and as both sides appeal decisions over how specific communications are classified. From Trump's perspective, these aspects of the order may be seen as providing some procedural protection and limiting how broadly prosecutors can present their case. From the prosecutor's perspective, however, the order also contains elements that could significantly weaken Trump's defense. First, the court explicitly rejected Trump's argument that all presidential communications are fully protected, drawing a clear line between official duties and personal or campaign-related activity. Communications in the personal or campaign category are not privileged, giving prosecutors access to evidence that may be especially damaging. Second, the court stated that even communications tied to official duties may still be considered when assessing Trump's knowledge and intent. While such material may not be used as direct proof of criminal conduct, evidence of intent and awareness is often central to establishing criminal liability. In practical terms, this allows prosecutors to rely on a substantial body of evidence to support key elements of their case. Third, the in-camera review process gives the trial judge considerable discretion in deciding whether individual communications are official or personal in nature. Given the judge's earlier rulings in this case, prosecutors may reasonably expect that many communications will be classified as personal or campaign-related and therefore fully admissible at trial. The Supreme Court's decision to take this nuanced approach rather than clearly siding with one party reflects the complexity of the constitutional issues involved. The justices appear to be attempting to balance the need to preserve executive privilege with the principle that former presidents can be held criminally accountable for serious misconduct. The framework they have created is intended to apply not only to Trump but to future presidents as well, preserving some degree of confidentiality while preventing privilege from being used as a shield for unlawful conduct. At the same time, this kind of middle ground ruling creates significant uncertainty in the short term. The lack of detailed guidance means further litigation is inevitable as both sides argue over how the new standard should be applied. Trump's legal team has remained silent, likely because the order contains both risks and potential advantages. Whether it ultimately benefits or harms Trump's defense will depend on how the next phase of litigation unfolds and how the trial court applies the Supreme Court's framework. Turning to what happens next, the immediate procedural effect of the Supreme Court's order is that the trial judge must conduct an extensive in-camera review of the communications prosecutors seek to introduce as evidence. This process requires the judge to privately examine disputed materials to determine whether each communication relates to official presidential duties or to personal or campaign activity. Depending on the volume of material and the complexity of these determinations, the review could take weeks or even months. Trump's legal team is likely to seek delays by arguing that a very large number of communications must be reviewed, by challenging the standards the court applies in making its classifications, and by pursuing interlocutory appeals of individual rulings they oppose. Prosecutors, by contrast, are expected to push for an expedited process, prioritizing the most significant communications and arguing that many materials are clearly personal or campaign-related and therefore require minimal analysis. One of the central challenges will be applying the distinction between official and personal communications to exchanges that combine both elements. For example, a single conversation may include discussion of legitimate governmental matters alongside discussions about efforts to overturn election results. The Supreme Court's order does not provide detailed guidance on how to categorize such mixed communications, leaving the trial judge to make discretionary judgments that are likely to be appealed. The court's reference to applying the framework established in Trump v. United States, including its discussion of official versus personal acts in the context of presidential immunity, offers some direction. However, that framework is relatively new and has not yet been widely tested in lower courts, adding further uncertainty to the process. Prosecutors moved quickly following the order, filing a motion seeking to shape how the in-camera review should proceed and to establish standards favorable to their case. In their filing, prosecutors argued that the determination should focus on the purpose of the communication rather than simply who participated in it or where it occurred. They contend that communications aimed at overturning election results or obstructing congressional proceedings were inherently personal or campaign-related, even if they involved senior government officials, because Trump was acting as a political candidate seeking to retain power rather than as a president carrying out constitutional duties. Under this purpose-based approach, many communications would likely be classified as personal and therefore fully admissible. Prosecutors also argue that the review process should be streamlined, with the judge evaluating groups of similar communications together rather than conducting an individualized analysis of each document. They further contend that materials prosecutors do not intend to introduce at trial should not be subject to review at all. Trump's legal team is expected to file a response proposing a more protective framework. They are likely to argue that communications involving senior government officials discussing governmental matters should be presumed official, regardless of any additional topics addressed. Under this approach, prosecutors would bear the burden of overcoming that presumption. Trump's lawyers are also likely to argue for a slow and highly individualized review process, even if it results in significant delays, and to contend that any communication whose status is uncertain should be excluded entirely rather than admitted with limiting instructions. The Supreme Court's statement that official communications may be considered for purposes of assessing knowledge and intent, but not as direct evidence of criminal conduct, also creates complex evidentiary and jury instruction issues. Distinguishing between evidence used to establish a defendant's state of mind and evidence used to prove criminal acts is conceptually difficult, particularly for jurors. For example, if jurors hear evidence that Trump was informed by senior officials that the election was not stolen and that information comes from communications deemed official, they may be instructed to consider it only for knowledge and intent. In practice, however, juries inevitably consider all evidence they hear when reaching their verdicts, regardless of limiting instructions. As a result, prosecutors may still derive substantial benefit from such communications, even though they are formally restricted from using them as direct proof of criminal conduct. The implications of this Supreme Court order extend beyond the immediate evidentiary disputes and reach broader questions about presidential accountability and the scope of conduct that can be prosecuted. By recognizing a category of official presidential communications that receive limited protection even in criminal proceedings, the court has created a framework that makes prosecuting current or former presidents more complex than prosecuting ordinary defendants. Going forward, prosecutors who bring charges against former presidents will likely be required to engage in similar in-camera reviews and to make careful distinctions between official and personal communications. This added procedural burden could discourage prosecutions in some cases or result in certain conduct going uncharged if key evidence is deemed privileged. At the same time, the court made clear that personal and campaign-related communications receive no privilege protection and that even official communications may be used to establish a defendant's knowledge and intent. Taken together, these principles reinforce that presidents are not above the law and that criminal accountability remains possible even with privilege protections in place. The political consequences of the court's decision are also significant because the ruling denies both sides clear, simplified talking points. Trump cannot plausibly argue that the Supreme Court is targeting or persecuting him when the court partially accepted his privilege claims and imposed limits on how some evidence may be used. At the same time, he cannot claim full vindication, as the court rejected his broadest privilege arguments and explicitly allowed prosecutors to use large categories of evidence, including official communications, to prove knowledge and intent. Similarly, Democrats cannot credibly claim that the court is shielding Trump from accountability, given that it rejected claims of absolute privilege and authorized extensive evidentiary use, but they also cannot argue that the court fully cleared the path for prosecution, as the ruling introduces new procedural barriers and requires time-consuming review processes that may delay trial proceedings. Trump's response to the order has been notably restrained. He has not commented publicly on the decision through social media, campaign statements, or legal surrogates. This silence stands out given his usual practice of reacting quickly to Supreme Court rulings, either by celebrating favorable outcomes or criticizing unfavorable ones. The lack of response suggests genuine uncertainty within Trump's legal team about whether the order ultimately benefits or harms his defense. That uncertainty appears justified. The order presents a mixed outcome that creates both strategic opportunities and legal risks. Trump's attorneys are likely waiting to see how the in-camera review proceeds and how the trial judge applies the Supreme Court's framework before framing the ruling as either a win or a setback. Legal experts have been closely examining the order to assess its practical impact. Many former federal prosecutors view the ruling as generally favorable to the government, noting that it preserves prosecutors' ability to use most relevant evidence while introducing additional but manageable procedural requirements. Defense attorneys say the order offers some protection for official presidential communications, but many acknowledge that the court's allowance to use those communications to show knowledge and intent significantly limits that protection. Constitutional law scholars are focusing less on the immediate case and more on what this ruling means for future efforts to hold presidents criminally accountable. The general view among experts is that the court has taken a small but meaningful step toward a workable framework, while leaving many critical questions unresolved and ensuring further litigation. In simple terms, the Supreme Court issued an unexpected order that partially granted and partially denied Donald Trump's request to block certain evidence. The court created a new process requiring in-camera review to separate official presidential communications from personal or campaign-related communications. It ruled that official communications may not be used as direct proof of criminal conduct but may be considered to show knowledge and intent. Personal and campaign communications, however, receive no privilege protection and may be used without restriction. This outcome surprised both Trump's legal team and prosecutors because it was not the clear win or loss either side expected. Instead, the ruling creates both opportunities and risks that will only become clear as the in-camera review proceeds and as courts apply the Supreme Court's new framework in practice. Trump's legal team has remained publicly silent, likely because they are still assessing whether this ruling ultimately strengthens or weakens their defense. Prosecutors, meanwhile, have already moved to shape how the review process will work, arguing for standards that would allow broader use of the evidence. This is not the sweeping victory for presidential immunity that Trump sought, nor is it the complete rejection of privilege that prosecutors wanted. It is a carefully balanced decision that attempts to protect executive confidentiality while preserving the ability to prosecute serious misconduct. Implementing that balance will require months of additional litigation. The final impact of the ruling will depend largely on how the trial judge classifies individual communications and how much evidence is admitted under the knowledge and intent standard versus excluded as direct proof of crimes. Trump's silence may reflect an understanding that while he avoided an immediate loss, the ruling could still create long-term risks if many communications are deemed personal or campaign-related. As the review process moves forward, the key question will be which communications the court allows jurors to see and for what purpose. Those decisions may ultimately shape how this case proceeds and how future cases involving presidential accountability are handled. If you want to stay informed as these legal developments continue to unfold, make sure to subscribe for verified court-focused coverage. We will continue tracking how the Supreme Court's framework is applied and what it means for the evidence presented at trial.